A man walked into a repair shop last winter and paid $4,000 to fix a problem that 60 years ago his grandfather would have fixed in an afternoon for the cost of a cup of coffee. He didn't know that. Nobody told him. The technician who handed him the invoice didn't know it either. Not because he was hiding anything, because he had never been taught the older way. It simply wasn't in the training manual he learned from. And that is the strange thing I want to show you today. Somewhere in the last 50 years, a very large body of practical knowledge quietly disappeared. Not knowledge about rockets or medicine or anything exotic. Ordinary knowledge. The kind of thing a farmer knew. The kind of thing a machinist could teach his son in an evening. Simple, cheap, effective ways of keeping machines running for decades. That knowledge didn't vanish because it stopped working. It stopped working perfectly the entire time. It vanished because something replaced it. Something more expensive, something more complicated, something far more profitable to sell. And the people who once carried that knowledge are almost all gone now. I spent a long time trying to find what was lost. What I found changed the way I look at every machine I own. Stay with me. Because the most important part of this story is not the trick, and it's not the history. It's the reason it was allowed to disappear. Let me start with a question that sounds simple, but almost nobody stops to ask. Why does it cost more to keep a modern car alive than it did to keep an old one alive? Think about that for a moment. Everything about a modern engine is better. The metals are stronger, the oil is better. The tolerances are tighter than anything a 1965 factory could dream of. The computers monitor 100 things a second. By every measure of engineering, a car built today should be almost impossible to kill. And yet, ask any honest mechanic how many 200,000-mile engines they saw 30 years ago, and how many they see now. Ask them why cars that are technically superior in every way so often get scrapped at 140,000 miles for a repair that costs more than the car is worth. They'll pause, because the answer doesn't fit the story we've all been told. We were told machines got better, so they'd last longer. The machines did get better. The knowledge of how to keep them alive got worse. That's the gap. And in that gap sits an enormous amount of money. But that gap didn't appear by accident. And to understand how it opened, I had to find someone who remembered the world before it. Every trade has a few people who write everything down. Most mechanics don't. They keep it in their hands, in their memory, and when they retire, it goes with them. That's part of how the knowledge disappeared. It lived in people, not in books, and people don't last. But once in a while, you find the exception. I found a man who had spent 41 years working on engines, trucks, tractors, cars, generators, anything with pistons. And he had done something almost nobody in his trade does. From the very beginning, he kept notebooks, not repair invoices, observations. What failed, what lasted, what the fluid looked like, what a bearing smelled like when it was about to go, which engines came back and which ones he never saw again. Decades of it in small handwriting and dozens of notebooks. When I asked him why he kept them, he said something I haven't been able to forget. He said the machines were always telling him things. He was just the only one writing them down. And then he said the second thing. He said that most of what was in those notebooks, nobody was teaching anymore. Not because it was wrong, because there was no money in it. I asked him if I could read them. What I found in the first few pages was so simple that I almost dismissed it. And that was exactly the mistake the whole industry had been counting on. The first thing that struck me wasn't a technique. It was a habit. Over and over in the earliest notebooks, the same idea appeared in different words. Before you fix a machine, you listen to it. Before you replace a part, you understand why it failed. The failure is never the beginning of the story. It's the end of a story that started much earlier. To a modern service department, that idea is almost useless. A modern shop is built around speed. A car comes in, a computer is plugged in, a code appears, a part is replaced, the car leaves. The whole model depends on not spending time understanding the machine. But the old way was the opposite. He described reading an engine the way a doctor reads a patient. The color of the oil told him about heat. The smell of the coolant told him about the metal it was touching. The sound of a cold start told him about clearance inside the bearings. A slight change in how the car idled told him something was shifting weeks before it would fail. None of this required a tool that cost more than a flashlight. All of it required attention. And here's the part that stopped me. He was diagnosing failures before they happened, not guessing. Reading. A machine, he insisted, almost never fails suddenly. It announces itself. Quietly, in small ways, long in advance. The sudden failure that strands you on the highway was almost always a slow failure that nobody was listening to. That was the first thing that had been lost. Not a trick. A way of paying attention. But attention alone doesn't explain how those old engines lasted so long. There was something more specific underneath it, and when I understood the science of it, everything else in the notebook started to make sense. Here's the principle that sat underneath almost everything in those pages. And once you understand it, you'll never look at a machine the same way. Metal doesn't wear evenly across its life. We imagine that a part slowly, steadily wears out over hundreds of thousands of miles, like a pencil getting shorter. That's not how it happens. The overwhelming majority of the damage a machine ever suffers happens in a tiny fraction of its running time. Think of it this way. Imagine a door hinge. If you swing it open and close gently 10,000 times, it lasts for decades. If you slam it hard even a few hundred times, it's ruined. The number of movements barely matters. The violence of a few of them decides everything. The engine is exactly the same. For most of its life, an engine is swimming in a protective film of oil. The moving parts never actually touch each other. They ride on a microscopic layer of pressurized oil, thinner than a human hair. And as long as that film is there, the metal is almost immortal. It could, in theory, run forever. The wear doesn't come from the running. It comes from the moments the film isn't there. And there is one moment, every single day, when that film is at its weakest. When the oil has drained down overnight and the metal is cold and dry and the first movement happens before the pressure has built. That moment is measured in seconds. The old man's notebooks were obsessed with those seconds. Every practice he recorded, boiled down, was about protecting the machine during the brief windows when it was vulnerable and ignoring it the rest of the time when it could look after itself. The modern service model does almost the opposite. It sells you attention on a calendar, every so many miles, whether the machine needs it or not, and teaches you nothing about the handful of moments that actually decide whether your engine sees 100,000 miles or 300,000. That was the science. The history of who understood it is even stranger. For most of the 20th century, this knowledge wasn't rare. It was ordinary. If you grew up on a farm, you knew it. A tractor was not a luxury you replaced. It was a tool you kept alive for 30 years because your livelihood depended on it. And there was no dealership 20 minutes away. You learned to listen to it. You learned to warm it before you worked it. You learned to read its fluids because a surprise failure in the middle of a harvest was a catastrophe. If you worked in a factory that ran machines all day, you knew it. The men who kept those machines running understood that a machine treated gently in its vulnerable moments would outlast a machine of twice the quality that was treated carelessly. If you drove for a living, you knew it. The drivers who got the most years out of an engine weren't the ones who serviced most often. They were the ones who understood how to start, how to warm, how to load, and how to listen. This knowledge moved the way all practical knowledge used to move, from hands to hands, father to son, old worker to young apprentice, in sheds and garages and fields, not in classrooms. It was never written in an owner's manual because it wasn't the manufacturer's job to teach it. It was common knowledge. You didn't print common knowledge. Everybody already had it, and that turned out to be its fatal weakness. Knowledge that lives only in people and is never written down is only ever one generation away from disappearing completely. All it takes is for one generation to stop passing it on, and that is exactly what happened. But it didn't happen randomly. Something specific caused it, and this is where the story stops being nostalgic and starts being uncomfortable. Here's the turning point. Somewhere in the last few decades, the relationship between a person and their machine changed. And it didn't change by accident. For most of history, the person who owned a machine was expected to understand it. The machine was designed to be understood. You could open it, see how it worked, and fix a great deal of it yourself. The knowledge and the machine belonged together. Then, slowly, the machine was closed. Not for one reason, several. Some of them are genuinely good. Cars became far more complex because they became far safer, far cleaner, and far more efficient. That complexity is real, and much of it protects you. But there was a side effect, and the industry noticed the side effects very quickly. When a machine becomes complex enough that an ordinary person can no longer understand it, something valuable happens to whoever sells the service. The owner stops being a participant and becomes a customer. Maintenance stops being a habit and becomes a transaction. Parts that could once be inspected were sealed. Fluids that were once checked were labeled lifetime, a word that quietly meant do not touch. Simple procedures were wrapped inside computerized systems that required special equipment to access. Each of these changes could be justified on its own. Together, they did something powerful. They moved the knowledge out of your hands and into a building you have to pay to enter. And here's the crucial part. Nobody had to conspire for this to happen. No secret meeting was required. It happened because of a simple, powerful truth about incentives. There is enormous money in complexity. There is no money in teaching people to look after their own machines. So one of those things was invested in, refined, marketed, and taught to every new technician. And the other was simply allowed to fade, not attacked, not banned, just quietly not passed on, until the generation that knew it grew old, and the notebooks went into boxes and garages, and the knowledge slipped below the surface of ordinary awareness. That's how it disappeared. Not with a bang, with silence. But when I went back through the notebooks with all of this in mind, I found something I'd missed, a pattern underneath the pattern. And it was bigger than cars. The more I read, the more I realized the old man had stumbled onto something that goes far beyond engines. It's a rule about how societies treat knowledge. Whenever a simple, cheap solution and a complex, expensive solution both work, the expensive one wins the future. Not because it works better, because it can be sold, marketed, funded, professionalized, and taught. The simple solution can't be sold, so no one has a reason to keep it alive. You can see this everywhere once you notice it. Simple food knowledge that kept people healthy for centuries fades, while complicated and expensive substitutes take its place. Simple ways of fixing, mending, and maintaining the things around us disappear, while the service industry grows up to do it for us at a price. Practical self-reliance quietly becomes dependence, one convenience at a time. None of it is evil. Most of it happened for understandable reasons, but the result is the same. A person today is surrounded by more technology than any human in history and knows less about how to keep any of it alive than their great-grandparents did. We didn't get less capable. We stopped being taught the things that make us capable, and the machines in our driveways are just the most visible example of it. Which brings me, finally, to the thing at the center of all of this. The single piece of forgotten knowledge that the old man circled again and again across 41 years of notebooks. The one he told me mattered more than everything else combined. This is the part I asked you to wait for. He put it very plainly. The entire life of an engine is decided in the first 30 seconds of each cold start, repeated over the years. Everything else is secondary. Remember the door hinge. Remember that almost all the wear a machine ever suffers happens in the brief moments its protective oil film is absent. There is one such moment every single day. When the engine has sat cold overnight, the oil has drained away from the top of the engine down into the pan, and the metal parts are sitting against each other with almost nothing between them. The instant you start it, those parts begin moving. But the oil pump needs a few seconds to push pressure up to where it's needed. For those few seconds, on a cold morning, the most important parts of your engine are moving against each other with far less protection than at any other time. Then, once it's running, the metal is still cold. Cold metal is a slightly different size than warm metal. The clearances the engineers designed are correct at operating temperature, not at the temperature of a freezing driveway. Ask a cold engine to work hard, to accelerate hard, to carry load in those first minutes, and you are asking parts that don't yet fit each other correctly to do their heaviest work. The old knowledge was simply this. In those first moments, ask for almost nothing, start the engine, give it a short, unhurried moment to move oil to where it belongs. Then drive gently, not slowly, gently, for the first few minutes, asking for no hard acceleration and no heavy load, until the machine has reached the temperature it was designed to work at. Only then treat it as fully alive. That's it. That's the whole thing. No cost, no part, no tool, nothing to buy. A few seconds of patience and a few minutes of gentleness at the start of each drive. The men who did this got engines that lasted 2 and 3 times longer than engines that were newer, better built, and more expensive. Not because they serviced more, because they understood the vulnerable moment and protected it every single day for the life of the machine. And this is the piece of knowledge that has most completely disappeared. Because there's nothing to sell in it. No product, no service, no appointment. It is pure knowledge, and pure knowledge is the one thing the modern service model has no reason to teach you. That's why your grandfather knew it, and you were never told. So let me bring this back to where we started. The man who paid $4,000 did nothing wrong. He trusted the only system he was ever offered. Almost all of us do. We were raised inside a world that took the knowledge out of our hands and quietly hoped we'd never notice it was gone. But it isn't gone, not completely. It survived in notebooks and old hands and a few people who kept writing things down while everyone else stopped. And it can be recovered, one idea at a time, by anyone willing to pay attention again. That's the whole purpose of what I'm doing here. Not to sell you anything. There's nothing to sell. Just to go back into the boxes in the garage, open the notebooks, and bring the forgotten knowledge back into the light where ordinary people can use it again. Because a person who understands their machine is a harder person to overcharge, and that has always been the point. There's one more thing in those notebooks I haven't shown you yet. A single page, near the back, about the sounds an engine makes in the weeks before it fails, the quiet warnings almost everyone drives straight past until it's far too late and far too expensive. That page deserves its own story. I'll tell you next.